Hello and welcome to a new virtual investment summit by Fund Society. Today we have the pleasure of having a program sponsored by Pictet Asset Management, and we're talking about thematic investments, specifically sustainable thematic investments, nutrition and clean energy. Pictet has been a leader in this topic for decades, and we have the pleasure to be organizing a panel with Jorge Corro, who is with me at the studio. Jorge is the head of the US Offshore for Pictet Asset Management, and two client portfolio managers, which Jorge will be introducing in a moment. I want to remind you that after the panel, there will be the opportunity to post questions to our panelists live. You can do it through the app in the WebEx application. There's a button at the bottom of your screens or at the left, depending if you're connecting from a mobile phone or your computer. Or you can also send your questions directly to info@fundsociety.com. The questions can be posted in English or in Spanish. We will translate them to the portfolio managers. So Jorge, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alicia. It's great to be back in Miami and here in the studio with you. And thank you to the audience who is joining us today. As Alicia mentioned, we're focusing on sustainability today. As you can probably be reading, all major economic blocs, Europe, China, and the US, have made commitments to achieve net zero emissions and to lower the carbon footprint of economic activity. Today, our goal is to speak about key trends behind the significant shifts affecting the energy and the food sector. And we believe that this transformation of the two industries is actually very, very important to achieve a more sustainable future. Today we're joined actually by two colleagues who are based in Geneva. I will start with Jennifer Boscarding-Ching and then introduce Gillian. Jennifer joined us in 2020 as part of, she's a client portfolio manager in our thematic equities group. Prior to coming to Pictet, he worked at RWE Renewables in Germany, where she was in charge of, or she supported the board and the CEO in making strategic decisions on how to steer the business to a more kind of clean energy markets. Jennifer holds a degree in political science from the University of California in LA, and a dual master's degree in environmental and energy management from Sciences Po in Paris and the Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. Our second panelist is Gillian Diesen. She joined Pictet in 2015 and is a product specialist for our thematic equities team also. And she's responsible for nutrition, premium brands, and the timber strategies we run. Prior to assuming her role, she was on the alternative investment side of our business, where she focused on strategy, marketing, and project management for Pictet Alternative Advisors. And before joining Pictet, she was based in Dubai. I'm sorry. Okay. So Gillian holds a BA in Modern History and Politics from the Queen's College of Oxford University, and she also has an MBA in Management from IMD. With that short intro, I'd like to invite Gillian who is going to give us a sort of a bit of a background and overall view of the nutrition sector, how we see it, and some of the trends we are seeing happening there today. Gillian, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jorge. I hope everyone can hear me all right. So today, first off, food systems. Why food systems? Because they're really at the heart of some of our most pressing global problems today, whether those are environmental or indeed social. And if we can skip to that very first slide, we can see what some of these challenges are. We're living in a world with a growing population, a world that we need to provide for nutritionally, but within the context of climate change and fewer resources available to us to do so, whether those are land or indeed water. We also have a global health crisis, and no, this is not COVID, this is actually malnutrition. Increasingly a double burden of malnutrition, with some 2 billion people in the world today suffering from lack of access to sufficient calories, and another 2 billion suffering from excess consumption of what we'd call empty calories. And this, of course, at a time where we're facing a pandemic in which we're seeing more and more evidence for this link between our diets and our health, seeing things like heart disease, diabetes, really coming and proving themselves to be ensuring a more severe COVID outcome, basically ensuring more vulnerability to infectious disease. So just to illustrate that on the next page, really food is one of the single biggest levers that we have to address these human and planetary health crises, and is pivotal to, as Jorge mentioned, achieving things like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the Paris Climate Agreement. And it's no coincidence that next week's UN is actually focusing on food, as is the COP26 that will be happening in Glasgow in November. To solve these problems, sadly, there's no single golden bullet. So we need to find solutions really across the food value chain, which is what we see on the next page. It translates into an estimated $2 trillion worth of investment opportunities from farm to fork, really on businesses helping to improve the sustainability of, the access to, and the quality of food we need for health and growth. So on the upstream side, we can focus in on solutions really geared towards producing more yield with fewer resources, things like precision agriculture, sustainable agriculture, and sustainable aquaculture. Midstream, we really are looking at access to that food and making the most of what we have. Roughly 1/3 of all the food we produce today is lost at some point along this value chain. So we really need to address things like food waste, whether that's through packaging, better sorting, or in fact repurposing food waste that we produce. And finally, of course, downstream, one of the most important elements here, food itself. So the food ingredients that are enabling these new generation food products, whether those are plant-based, fortified, and reformulating the foods that we love to having a healthier nutritional profile. Less salt, less fat, less sugar, but still just as appetizing. So some of the things you see on the next page are really examples of the kinds of technologies and business models that are helping to shape a more sustainable food future. Some examples: vertical farming, something that allows us to grow year-round fresh produce on the doorsteps of very densely populated areas, shortening these very long, complex global food supply chains that we have today that not only incur a lot of risk of contamination, but also costs, economic costs of logistics, but also environmental costs. So this is a key element here, as is things like food sorting, making sure that bruised but perfectly fine to eat tomato is not going to sit on the grocery store shelf, but can be sorted out really at the source to go to ketchup, tomato soup, tomato juice, without letting it go to waste. Equally, on the second row there, you see new generation food examples, whether these are functional foods, things like probiotics, which are seen to have immunity boosting properties, or indeed plant-based products that are seen to be more sustainable and in many cases healthier food. Equally, direct to consumer, food delivery, portion controlled, all of these things are the types of business models that you would be expecting to invest in for a more sustainable food future. And why is it important to discuss these things today? It's not just because I think COVID has really put these issues in the spotlight, nor is it because the UN and more NGOs are really seeing this as a key element for us in solving our environmental or social problems. But it's also because for the first time, to some extent, the stars seem to be aligned. And if you go to the next page, you can see what I mean. On the one hand, we have regulation, we have government starting to advocate for more sustainable food practices. We see it in the US, we see it in China, we see it in the EU as well, with things like the EU Green Deal that's really focusing on better food strategies and food waste reduction. But we're also seeing consumer behaviors change. People want better quality food. They're willing to pay potentially higher prices for the quality. And at the same time, we're reaching a stage of innovation in which big corporates along that food value chain actually have the technologies available to them to cater to these consumer and government demands for healthier nutrition. The Financial Times, you can see the quote there on the bottom, summed it up quite well here, I think. They say it's just the beginning. This has been a very nascent space for quite some time, but it seems to very much be growing in terms of size of opportunity. We're seeing a lot of capital market activity and new IPOs, but also in terms of momentum and interest as we see larger and larger amounts of capital flow into this very important space. So hopefully that's whetting your appetite for nutrition this morning.
Thank you, Gillian. And next, Jennifer is going to give us a brief overview of the clean energy sector. And after that, we're going to sort of reconvene for a panel discussion about some topics within these two very interesting industries. So take it away, Jennifer. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jorge. And hi, everyone. So I'm here today to talk about, well, basically the energy transition. And having been in the energy industry, what I can say is that when we typically think of energy, people think it's quite a boring topic, but I can say it's actually quite the opposite. There's a lot of innovation, a lot of fascinating things happening at this moment as we speak. So just before I move on to the next slide, I just first wanted to just kind of give everyone an impression of what we're talking about when we mean energy. Because a lot of people, they look at energy and they think, oh, well, this is just, especially if we're talking about clean energy, then it's about renewables, it's about wind, and it's about solar, and that's it. But actually, if you think about our relationship to energy, it's basically, it's the driver of society, right? I mean, right now, it's what's keeping our lights on in our rooms. It's allowing me to be at this conference right now. It's what you cook your food with, through your cook stoves. And so all of this is part of a larger energy complex that touches everything in our lives, from basically how energy is produced, what kind of sources or fuels for energy that we use, all the way to how it's being transported or distributed through electric grids, for example, all the way to how we use it in our buildings, in the manufacturing industries, and also how we use it for transport. So with that being said, why don't we go on to the first slide, and I'll talk a little bit about basically the fundamentals of our energy systems that's driving a transition in this whole complex globally today. So just as a large overview, what we can see now is that, especially over the past 2 to 3 years, there has been a large shift in all sorts of different areas in terms of mentality towards our energy systems, and most largely because of, well, one, air pollution, and then two, let's say largely because of one, the public awareness and kind of the views towards human health and air pollution in cities resulting from car emissions, for example, but also in terms of the impacts of climate change and its relationship to kind of more extreme weather events, as we've been seeing this year. And then we've now seen also on the regulatory and government side, a lot of momentum going in this direction, which I'll talk about in a bit more later. And then also, most importantly, I wanted to talk a little bit about all of the technology innovation that has happened over the past 10 years that has really allowed clean energy solutions to now be on the forefront of where our energy systems are going to develop going forward. So that's where all the growth is going to be. So if we can actually move on to the next slide, I'll just talk a little bit first about just kind of public perception and awareness. So I'm just going to throw out a few numbers first in relation to, first of all, well, just generally climate change. Maybe all of you were probably aware of, let's say, the floods or the kind of extreme weather events that we have been increasingly experiencing over the last years. And for the first time this year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is signed by 195 countries and approved, used the word that it is unequivocal that our that human activity, our kind of energy systems, the way that, or let's say not just energy, but our kind of the way that we are putting carbon emissions into the atmosphere is linked to extreme weather events and kind of greater risk of changing climate. And so if you just think about Hurricane Ida, for example, on the east coast of the US, the estimated damage just over those kind of 1 or 2 nights has been between 70 to 80 billion US dollars. And this has been estimated to cost insurers about 18 billion US dollars. So, and we're seeing kind of these same patterns worldwide. And as that happens, we also see growing consensus amongst the public, along with increasing awareness and information, that there is definitely a need to act. Same thing goes for air pollution. As more and more studies are coming out worldwide about the impacts of smog, of fine particles in the air, and how this impacts human health and especially child development, we're also seeing a growing, let's say, a growing urgency to start to address that. And the good thing is that we know how a lot of these can be addressed. Our energy systems, including kind of transportation, including electricity, in just our kind of general energy consumption, accounts for the majority, large percentage of these. Basically, it's causing a lot of these things. And so by addressing those and switching to more cleaner energy sources and supply, we can effectively address that. So, but this is just on the kind of general public kind of perception and consumer side. But if we go to the next slide, there's also a lot of, let's see what's happening on the kind of some of the other areas. Let's talk about the government and on the regulatory side. So here what you see on this slide in front of us is actually just a simple timeline of events that have happened since the end of 2019. So just over the past, let's say 1.5 years or 2 years, in terms of climate change ambitions, reaching net zero, and it's actually accelerating. And what's so interesting is that really we're at the point where for the first time in history, we actually have general consensus amongst most of the governments and major economies worldwide, where there is a need to kind of act towards transforming our energy systems towards something that's more sustainable in the future, to address air pollution, to address climate change. And so you can see this happening, for example, in Asia. You have Japan, China, and South Korea all committing to net zero and carbon neutrality by 2050 or 2060. You have in the US with the Biden administration also very strong on the climate change topic. And now they're basically proposing this very ambitious kind of clean energy infrastructure plan. You have in the UK, the Boris Johnson basically announcing the Green Industrial Revolution. You have in Europe, the European Green Deal. And so basically we're seeing from a regulatory perspective, shifts also in this space that will basically start to reward companies that are basically leaders of this transition or are providing solutions to help our energy systems transition to a cleaner mode. Versus, let's say, companies that are on the wrong side of this transition that are very polluting or very emissions intensive are those that are much more likely to become penalized or facing more headwinds in the future. So, so with that being said, I think I'm still missing one very important piece of the puzzle, which is on the next slide, in terms of why is all of this happening now, and why did it not happen 10 years earlier, or why won't it only happen 10 years later? Because in all honesty, I mean, governments have been talking about climate change since 1995 or 1990 with the Kyoto Protocol. And so what's truly changed that's allowing kind of these inflection points to happen starting to happen since the past, let's say, 2 years? And that is really, I have to say, is being driven by the technology innovation that has happened over the past decade that has allowed the cost to fall down so drastically that a lot of our clean energy solutions today are actually now the most competitive and most economically competitive and the ones that make sense to build out and to use going forward, just simply because they've become so cheap. And then if here there's just a few numbers, but if you look at solar energy, I mean, the costs have dropped by 80% over the past 10 years. And so in many parts of the world now, it actually makes more sense from an economic perspective, from a utility or a government perspective, to build more solar plants going forward than to continue running existing fossil fuel plants, just because it's just the cheapest option. And so that's just an idea of kind of what are the kind of key drivers that have been driving, that are starting to really drive the energy transition going forward. And we only see these as accelerating over the time period of the next decade. So with that being said, I will just quickly wrap up in terms of, what are the opportunities, or what is the investment universe that would fall within the realm of the energy transition. So if we move on to the next slide, you can see that here, if we're talking about the universe, and this relates to what I said in the beginning, it's not just about wind and solar. I mean, of course, that's a very large component, but if we think about our whole energy complex as a whole, actually there's a lot of things which are going to be completely disrupted or completely transformed. So if we think about our energy system going from the left side, there's supply of energy, which going forward, every single major energy forecast or outlook or report has said that the expectation is that wind and solar will be the largest growth technologies going forward, not just because of regulatory support, but also because of the cost and economic perspective. And then there's a lot of things in the middle. Once you produce that electricity, how to get that to the consumer. And so there's the enabling infrastructure aspect, which is really referring to our transmission grids and those electricity lines that you see out there that will need to be basically built out to reach people that don't have access to energy, but also will need to be modernized and upgraded to accompany this energy transition. And then finally, at the right-hand side, there's also this other very important part, which is actually about how we use energy, and it's really here related to energy efficiency. And this touches every part. It's very cross-cutting across different types of industries, different types of sectors. It touches buildings, for example, and real estate. We can see in a lot of these new regulations and laws coming out, there's more incentives for energy efficiency in buildings, more insulation in buildings, retrofitting old light bulbs that are very energy wasteful with new LED light bulbs, for example. We can see on the manufacturing space, industries are also have the pressure or the need to decarbonize. So they also need to look for solutions to make their manufacturing processes much more efficient and much intensive going forward. And then finally, of course, in smart mobility, this is really referring to our transport systems. And we can already see as well, not everywhere yet, but we see in many places, especially in China, in Europe, and eventually also and in the Americas, again, an acceleration point or an inflection point in the uptake of electrification of transport and e-mobility. Again, partly due to consumer habits, partly due to governmental incentives, but mostly because of also the cost of batteries that it requires for EVs has dropped so drastically over the past years that most large car manufacturers today, Volkswagen, BMW, General Motors, they all estimate that by 2025, they can produce electric vehicles at very, very competitive cost parity with traditional cars. And so basically, if you think about all of this, then it lends to a very, very large kind of investment universe. And below, we also have, if you think further up the value chain of the energy value chain, what we call enabling technologies. So this refers to storage, batteries, it refers to semiconductors, which are very important components of all of these different segments that we see at the top. Semiconductors are ubiquitous in solar panels, for example. They're important for electric vehicles as well. And so we expect that all of these segments are going to receive a lot of tailwinds going forward, and there's going to be an acceleration in growth due to kind of the general net zero targets that we're seeing worldwide. So with that being said, I've probably talked quite a lot, so I will pass it now back to Jorge, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jennifer. I do have questions for you, but we're going to start with a question for Gillian. And during the overview, Gillian, you mentioned that and all these different dynamics that are taking place, allowing us to kind of feed people and do it more healthy way. But I'm sure there are some environmental challenges that are going to kind of push back either water scarcity, some other environmental challenges that might be out there. So what do you think, what's the challenge for the future of food as we see it today?
I think those are all the things that I mentioned. It's this production issue together with the amount of arable land that we have available, the amount of water that we have available. And really for us, the way that we look at nutrition and potential investment opportunities is by constantly looking at essentially these trade-offs between health of people and planet at the same time. So we try to evaluate every type of investment or solution, let's say, to these problems with both of these things in mind. So health of people and of planet. And obviously some of the solutions that you see are some of the things that I mentioned: vertical farming, precision agriculture technology, so see and spray, allowing us to divert additional nutrients or resources to very specific crops as opposed to an entire field, for example.
Perfect. As part of the research that I did for this webcast, I ate an Impossible Burger, and I have to say it was very good. But I imagine there are other areas that are going to be sort of affected by what we call new foods going forward. Any thoughts on that? Any new companies or sort of developments that you see there that are going to kind of
Absolutely. We're seeing
other
new companies in this space almost every day. I think you've seen lots of IPOs in this space. Many of them I don't think need an introduction. Most recently, Oatly, a little bit of time ago, Beyond, as you mentioned. But I think, this is really the first step in many ways of these plant-based new generation food products. What we might be seeing down the road is actually lab-based meat. So actually meat made from animal protein, but within a lab to really reduce those environmental impacts, bearing in mind that to produce beef, for example, this has a feed conversion ratio of roughly 6:1. You need 6 times the amount of input to produce this 1 unit of output, which arguably is not that great for our health anyway. So we're seeing, advances really on that front. There are a lot of people advocating a better use of insects, for example, but also more advances and better technology when it comes to things like fish farming, which when it comes to animal protein, this is a sort of protein that has a feed conversion ratio of closer to 1:1. So almost everything you put in, you get out as a very highly nutritional product that's really overall fairly good for our health. So these are some of the things that we're seeing really in that new generation food space.
Perfect. And Jennifer, I have a question for you now. I read somewhere that in the last 20 years, energy consumption in the US has actually remained fairly stable, while population, I think, grew by 25%, the economy by 40%. Can you explain, how is this possible and what the trend is going forward in terms of energy consumption? And we're going to be able to use less and do it more in a more environmentally friendly way?
Yeah, the reason for this trend that you just mentioned, it's 2 words. It's energy efficiency. We've gotten so much better at producing or manufacturing or doing things with less, basically. And so that is actually a very important part of this energy transition universe. Because on one hand, while you have a transition in your supply of energy away from fossil fuels or polluting sources towards clean sources, we also need to manage the other side, which is the demand side, and make sure that it's not just continuous growth in demand, unlimited growth in demand, because then it gets very hard to manage our energy systems and the electric grid. So actually, the US is a good example of how it's completely possible to keep your demand stabilized, even though you have increase in population, increase in economic activity through energy efficiency solutions. And this is as I mentioned earlier, it can come in all sorts of different areas or industries. In the manufacturing industry, for example, there are simulation software solutions out there today that basically help a manufacturer to reduce the amount of energy and cost and time that they need to use to create a new prototype, simply by prototyping a new product, maybe an engine, for example, in the virtual space, and running that through very smart simulations and scenarios. And that kind of optimizes the product from the get-go, instead of having to create one prototype and then testing it physically and then doing that again. So all of these are examples of solutions in the energy efficiency space that are allowing for this trend that you mentioned to happen, and are actually also receiving a lot of support and incentives from the government in general. I think support just because saving electricity is always good for our pockets. I mean, it lowers your electricity bills, but two, from an environmental perspective, it also makes sense because at some point we cannot have unlimited consumption, so demand needs to be able to remain stable. So.
Perfect. And when we mentioned the U.S., we mentioned Europe and China all aligned for the first time ever in kind of making the economy less carbon intensive. Within the segments of the clean energy space, where do you see that government spending having the biggest effect, and connected to that also, in the past, renewables especially benefit from a lot of subsidies that, of course, sort of went away during the great financial crisis. How is that sort of dynamic today, and what are governments doing to incentivize further use?
Yeah. Okay, so I will address the segments question first, and then we'll talk about the subsidies. So within the segments, if you remember that final slide that I had about kind of how we look at the clean energy universe and those different segments that are within it, this is honestly, it's I have to very honestly say that I think that if we look and analyze these government kind of like the European Green Deal, the kind of the Chinese energy plans, it will actually benefit every single segment, simply because also governments know that it's not just about one thing or the other, not just about renewables, but actually really making our whole energy system much more efficient. So just to give you an example, within the US bipartisan infrastructure plan bill, so not the large reconciliation bill, because there's a lot more in there that will support renewable energy through tax credits and through and also a support for electric mobility. But just in that kind of smaller bipartisan infrastructure plan, there's about 70 billion that is going towards electric grid and transmission upgrades. Because it's actually important that if we're going to build out more renewables or replace old coal and gas plants with renewable energy, then we actually also need to upgrade and build out more electric grid infrastructure as well. So I would say that every segment of the clean energy, let's say, system or universe is actually going to benefit from all of these plans, because they actually touch on everything. For renewable energy, let's just say in the US, you have tax credits. This is just from like a regulatory perspective. In Europe, you also have other incentives. You have fixed kind of remuneration schemes through auctions, for example, and it's the same in China. So in the e-mobility part, you also have incentives there. You have tax rebates for EVs, but I think now, having touched on that, I'm going to talk about the subsidy part, because everything that I mentioned just now is all good in the sense that, you know, government regulations are there in the sense that they can serve to accelerate the energy transition. But the main point I want you to take away with today is that it's not like the energy transition does not even rely so much on government efforts anymore. It can just happen it's going to happen on its own anyways, just from a pure efficiency and economics perspective. So indeed, renewables, when they had subsidies, this was around 2000, let's say until 2007 or 2008, right, when they got taken away with the financial crisis, and that was a big hit. But it's been more than a decade since then, and the cost of building renewables today, or let's say the levelized marginal cost on a unit, like kind of on every per unit of energy, so megawatt hours, is so different from the situation 10 years ago. Nowadays, you can actually build renewable energy without subsidies at the most competitive price there is. So it's basically out-competing all other kinds of energy sources anyways, just based on competitiveness alone. And I think with EVs, we're not fully there yet, but most of the major car manufacturers have said that by 2025, they expect the same thing to happen for EVs, where they can sell EVs at a much more competitive price than combustion engine vehicles. So just based on economics, I think the trend is going to go there anyways. And the regulations are there to really help accelerate and enforce that.
Perfect. And staying with electric vehicles or transportation in general, they talk about electric planes, electric buses. What is helping this development? What is keeping it sort of maybe or slowing it down? And also, what is the effect on energy demand if eventually all cars are electric, or we're doing electric buses, things like that?
Yeah. So I think I will talk mostly about electric cars and buses, and I think electric planes we're still kind of quite far away from that. I think that's probably planes and shipping is probably going to be one of the last or hardest kind of transportation industries to decarbonize, just because it's very difficult to put a huge battery on a ship. Like it doesn't really make sense. So what's kind of challenging for electrification of transport when we're talking about vehicles? I think that the biggest, let's say, bottleneck right now is probably just the charging infrastructure. So it's a bit of a chicken and the egg issue, because you want people to use electric cars, but there's no charging infrastructure. But then the charging infrastructure doesn't really make sense if you don't have electric cars. But honestly, we had the exact same issue when combustion engine cars first came to the market. Everyone thought that no way we would be using cars. I mean, horses are so much more convenient. Everybody has a horse. And look how quickly that changed. So with kind of also with increase in kind of charging stations that are being built out, and we also see this again in the infrastructure plans in the US, for example. There's and the base plan is to build out 700,000 more electric vehicle charging stations across the US. We see that this is something that's going to happen. And then in terms of what does this do to energy demand? So there was a study in the UK that estimated if the whole kind of UK car fleet switched to electric cars, it would only increase the overall electricity demand by about, I think, 5 to 8%. So it's actually not as big as people think, and that's because it's not just about you're not adding electricity demand, but you're also this has to be looked at together with increased energy efficiency, and then at some point when you have very kind of intelligent grids, the fact that cars themselves can also be the batteries in cars can also be used as a power supply to the grid. So it actually gets quite complicated, but it's overall, I would say that the balance between kind of increasing EVs versus increasing energy efficiency kind of balances it out.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Very interesting, Jennifer. Gillian, let's talk a little bit about access to food. I mean, I think 600 million people in the world don't have secure access to food, and at the same time, we deal with obesity, and a lot of like weight-related issues in the world. How do you see the industry kind of moving in that direction, helping again provide the right nutrition to people that don't have access to it, but also limiting the consumption of extra calories?
Absolutely. I think you've got a few different things at play here. Some of them will hark back to a lot of the things that Jennifer was talking about on her end. So there is something that we can do with regards to regulation. We're starting to see that already. Last summer, the UK, for example, put in a lot of new restrictions on advertising junk food, for example. We've seen sugar taxes in many parts of the world. So you have regulation playing a little bit of a part there, trying to push consumers to make better choices, but also push corporates to improve the quality food that they provide. And of course, those corporates are equally being pushed by consumers who are voting with their feet for more plant-based products, for example. So I think this is an area in which regulation can help us to accelerate this change towards a more sustainable and higher quality food system. but it's where we see consumers really voting with their feet as well and wanting to make that change and choosing those products themselves. At the same time, I think you're starting to see business models encouraging this access, democratizing access to some extent of a lot of these products. So whether these are more direct to consumer food delivery platforms, helping to connect consumers with local farms, local producers, for example, or indeed just bringing food production closer to that end consumer, whether that's through a vertical farming type technology. All of these things are ingredients in really helping to allow better access or force better access in some cases to higher quality nutrition.
Perfect. And in terms of food waste, which is, I mean, it's sort of sad that on one hand you have people with not enough access to food, and then I think 1/3 of like food in the world gets just wasted. Technologies or initiatives that are sort of trying to help address that. I know they talk a lot about also about expiration dates, for instance, and how they're misleading and people throw things away before they can, while they're still edible, basically. So, any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's shocking that 1/3 of all the food we produce today is lost along this value chain. Mm-hmm. And it depends. Sometimes, especially in more developing markets, that food waste is happening really upstream. In more developed markets, it's happening downstream. And so I think really we need a variety of different approaches to this food waste problem. We can look at things like packaging that might target not just the food we produce as a result of all the plastic and the packaging that we use for food itself, but also, as you mentioned, this extension of shelf life. Mm-hmm. In the places like the US or Western Europe, it's shameful how much we buy. We fill up our refrigerators, and we have food that goes to waste. It goes past the expiry date and it goes in the garbage. So how can we have better packaging to help extend that shelf life? And it might not just be packaging, and by the way, packaging from more sustainable sources. So for example, wood-based packaging. So wood-based aseptic packaging technologies that help to extend shelf life and reduce that food waste pollution, packaging pollution, but equally things like bioprotection, so using natural enzymes to help preserve food rather than through synthetic preservatives. In addition, you have food sorting, which I mentioned earlier, but also food waste repurposing. So companies that will actually go around, gather food waste from large industrial kitchens and repurpose it into animal feed, for example, or other uses, lubricants, and so on. So this is a major problem in our food systems today, and it requires a bunch of different solutions.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you so much for that. I have many more questions for the two of you, but we also have an audience, and they've been sending us some questions. So Alicia is going to sort of take over the Q&A and direct the questions to you guys.
Thank you, Jorge. Yes, we have several questions for both of you. Some are more related to your portfolios, and others are more about the topic. To follow up with Gillian regarding food, we have a question regarding the organic movement, organic food movement, or bio food movement. I don't know how you call it in Europe, because it's true that there are new technologies that are enabling the production of beyond meat, for example. This kind of meat and fish, which are grown in a laboratory. But where does this food stand against the organic trend? I don't see an organic food lover eating an artificial burger, just to put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think first of all, from an investment perspective, your lab-grown meats for the moment tend to be on the private end of the space, so there are very few opportunities there for publicly listed equities. I think when it comes to bio and organic, a lot of the things that we're looking at in terms of, I mentioned already, precision agriculture. This is not just about resource efficiency, but it's also about ensuring that we can grow produce with fewer chemicals. Of using a lot of pesticides or fertilizers actually degrades the soil that we use, degrades the biodiversity, and ultimately degrades the nutritional profile of the produce we grow on that land. So it's in our interest to actually reduce the chemical use and the overworking of the land, which has been a trend that we've seen in nutrition and food production for several decades now. So I think it's not really about either or, organic biofood versus lab-grown meat. All of these are solutions to a more sustainable food future, and depending on where we are in the world, we really need a barrage of lots of these different types of solutions to help deal with the magnitude of the environmental and social problems we face linked to our food systems.
Thank you. Jennifer, I have another question for you. A lot of the audience that is following us today is based in Miami, Houston, Southern California, New York. A lot of Latin American wealthy families have properties in these areas of the United States, and we have seen how the storms, the fires are doing a lot of damage, and climate change is something that is worrying all of us. You have talked about technology that can help move into a cleaner energy world. I think that the technology is there, but we have a question asking if it's true that there are strong lobbies from older industries that are putting things difficult for these new technologies to catch ground and to move into a decarbonized world. Sorry.
Yeah, so I don't really want to get into like too much of a political discussion here, and so maybe I will distance kind of whatever I say from Pictet and things like that. But I was just saying, in general, it's natural that any existing strong kind of industry or lobbying entity that has benefited and profited from certain kind of tax breaks or subsidies will want to kind of continue holding on to those. And I don't think it would just be limited to the US. It would be a phenomenon that's happening, that's worldwide. But that being said, I think what is quite interesting to actually think about or look at is if you look at what some of the major, let's just say oil and gas majors, what they're doing today. Not so much on the US side yet, but if we're talking about the European oil and gas majors like Shell and BP, I think it's very telling that all of them have as well net zero targets and are also starting to aggressively trying to transition their businesses away to also more clean energy, a clean energy business model. So I think that the writing's there on the wall. It's always the case that incumbent industries, that are at risk of being disrupted or are at risk of losing out from large transformations in society are going to fight it. And then this has happened many times in history before as well. But yeah, so it's definitely there. It happens, but at the same time, it's also interesting if you look at who are the ones that are also trying to make a change because they know that probably going forward it's not going to be so effective anymore trying to fight things. So.
Thank you. This links with another question about the universe of your strategies. Regarding energy, we have a question about if your strategy does hold positions in these oil and gas companies that are doing the right thing, or do you directly do not invest in those companies? And later on, I will follow up with Gillian with another question about her universe.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, our universe, the clean energy strategy, is energy transition strategy. So what does this mean? It does mean that if you have energy producers or energy utilities that are very serious about their transition and have proved and I'll just give some examples. That's, this is going to be their major focus of investment going forward. Then that could fall into the universe. Now, we do have kind of some strict thresholds. For example, if there's more than a certain percentage of nuclear or oil and gas or coal, then that would automatically be excluded. But generally, in order to get into the universe, there's a very kind of high standard that we look at, in the sense that there have been utilities that have been before predominantly generating their electricity from coal, but are now moving forward. Their assets have actually shifted to majority renewables. And so before that enters our universe, we actually do heavy engagement with them. And this can last anywhere between 1 to 2 years, where we really ensure that their capex plan or their investment plans going forward are going to be into clean energy solutions. They have either they have agreements with the government or plans to shut down their coal plants over the next years, so that it's a very clear transition. What we don't do, what does not come into the universe, is if a company that's out there says, well, we have net zero ambitions and that's our goal, but there's actually, it's kind of like they need to walk the talk in that sense. So if there is actually some substance behind that, then okay, but it's not that any company that says they are going to transition will make it into the universe.
Perfect, thank you very much. And Gillian, there is also some curiosity about the investment universe in your strategy. They are asking us if plant-based commodities or agriculture, this kind of investments are inside your universe or not at all?
For the moment, no. We're really trying to focus on, let's say, value-add products where we can really get premium pricing, for example, and also products that are less cyclical, less volatile, which are obviously characteristics that one tends to see a lot with commodities markets that people will speculate on, their raw materials. So these are not part of our universe.
Okay, perfect. But then I have another question because they are asking that food and beverages are normally, as you said, sort of defensive companies. Do you have a growth component to your portfolio?
Absolutely. And what's interesting about this portfolio is, as you mentioned, it is very defensive, which is unsurprising given that we are looking at food, consumer staple. They tend to be quite low beta, quite defensive, which is certainly the case with this portfolio. That said, you have exposure also to these industrial components in your ag tech space, your food delivery, direct to consumer type platforms, which are digital and online, but also your materials, which are particularly food ingredients. And so given the fact that we're not looking at commodities and we're really trying to focus on these real value add type products, this is where you see quite a substantial amount of growth in addition to this defensiveness provided by essentially consumer staples. Because at the end of the day, we all need to eat.
Absolutely. I have a further question. Maybe it's going to be the last, and I would like to ask both of you if you can talk about examples in which you have had a role as an active investor. Pictet Asset Management has a role as an active investor and engaged in the companies you invest in or you're planning to invest in. Jennifer, you talked a little bit about this. Maybe you can give us another example, and maybe then, Gillian, you can talk about some examples in the food industry.
So should I go first then? Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the example I gave just now is one where basically it's a European energy utility, and we had engaged with them for about 2 years, from over 2018 and 2019. And after basically their coal phase out plans, well, basically we were pushing them to kind of, go through, make sure that the transition is proper before taking holding a position in that company. And so it was really after their coal phase out plans were made very, very concrete, and it was in fact publicized, and so they can also be held accountable for what they're doing. Then that was basically when we decided to take a position. So that's already one example. There are also other examples where, due to if there's a very, very severe kind of ESG issue that comes out that was maybe not something that was foreseeable, it can actually lead to, of course, removing that company from the portfolio. So we also had an example where there was a company that was a provider of insulation material in buildings that was linked to a very, very destructive fire, and that actually caused quite a lot of deaths. And there was some murky things about it where it was revealed after an investigation that there were also some, let's say, malpractices by management. And so at this point, this is where we all definitely go in and start an engagement with the management and kind of see what's going on and really try to look into it in more depth. And if we felt like, okay, there was bad governance there, and that's, we don't see things improving, then that could actually also lead to, let's say, a divestment decision. But that being said, I think I wanted to make it very, very clear that at Pictet, we are not activist investors. That's not what we do. That's not who we are. But of course, what we want to do is practice kind of be responsible shareholders and stakeholders in that sense. So,
thank you, Jennifer. So, Gillian, can you give us your example?
Absolutely, and just perhaps to give a little background from the nutrition side, because Jennifer mentioned it for clean energy, equally for us, there are lots of exclusions to our investments. We don't want to put in capital, for example, to companies who are really businesses being driven by alcohol or pesticides or fertilizers or red meat, confectionery, processed meats, all of these things that require so much of our resources to produce and that ultimately don't have positive health outcomes. So in everything that we choose to direct capital to or not, we're trying to justify as much as possible with scientific research on health for people and planet. So with that in mind, of course, there are thresholds for these exclusions. And for example, we can think about a lot of some of the really major, well-established food product producers, which have very diversified product mixes and product portfolios, which are quite often also producers of confectionery, but whom we've seen really transition these product portfolios to things that are much more nutritious, much more in line with the sorts of values that we have around nutrition. But of course, it takes time to turn these big ships around. And so these would be examples of companies with whom we would be engaging to help push the divestment of processed meats, of ice creams, of confectionery, and really put more of their dollar and their R&D spend into products that are nutritional. So, for example, more functional foods, plant-based food for oncology patients, for people in hospital who may not be able to eat normally, things like this.
Great, thank you.
And again,
very much.
as Jennifer said, we're really long-term investors here.
Absolutely. So thank you very much, Gillian. Thank you, Jennifer. Jorge, would you like to add anything else?
No, just thank you, Alicia, and the Fan Society team, Jennifer and Gillian. Thanks so much for taking the time for this virtual investment summit. The title is "The Future is Sustainable," and I think we have shown people that this is not just wishful thinking, but an achievable target within the energy and the food sectors. So thanks a lot. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. and I'll be happy to share more information about clean energy and nutrition with you. Thanks a lot.
That's brilliant. So thank you very much to our audience. And I want to remind you that this program has been recorded and you will be receiving a link to access the program in the following days. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.